Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome back to all of you to the second session of the Social Research Conference, India's World. My name is Vaijayanti Rao and I'm a... Am I not? Okay. Thank you. My name is Vaijayanti Rao and I'm an assistant professor of anthropology here at the New School. And it's my great privilege, actually, to be introducing this group of speakers, this panel, some of whom have been my teachers and whose work I have long admired. And before I go on to introduce the panel, which is on literature, culture, and media, I'd like to tell you that the papers that you will hear this afternoon will cover quite a wide range of topics in the fields of literature, culture, and media. But what these papers do is that they bring us back to the significance of the term culture in all the senses in which it has been used in the modern era, from aesthetic production to mediations of experience, and to the structures responsible for producing and maintaining collective meaning and memory. Specifically, they point us to the vital role that culture has to play in defining and working through a sense of social and political crisis, one that has become ubiquitous and indeed almost an existential condition for many Indians, whether they be captains of industry and members of the political elite, or the poor and the marginalized who are forced to accrue impossible debts just in order to remain viable in the public worlds of India. So the papers that you will hear this afternoon are first from Professor Sheldon Pollock, who will present a paper called Crisis in the Classics, followed by Professor Lawrence Cohen, from Berkeley, who will present Accusations of Illiteracy and the Medicine of the Organ, followed by Terrorism, Conspiracy, and Surveillance in Bombay's Urban Cinema by Ranjani Mazumdar, and finally, From Karma to Karma, The Resurgence of Puritanism in Contemporary India by Professor Wendy Doniger. And I will tell you about the speakers in a minute, but you can see that these papers do cover a very wide swath of cultural politics. So Professor Pollock is the William B. Ransford Professor of Sanskrit and Indian Studies at Columbia University. His areas of specialization are Sanskrit philology, Indian intellectual and literary history, and increasingly comparative intellectual history. His publications include a monograph, The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, Sanskrit, Culture, and Power in Pre-Modern India, which won the Kumaraswamy Prize and the Lionel Trilling Award, and the edited volume Literary Cultures and History, Reconstructions from South Asia. Two forthcoming book projects are entitled Liberation Philology and A Reader on Rasa, a historical source book in Indian aesthetics. He is the recipient of the Distinguished Achievement Award in 2008 from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for significant contributions to humanistic inquiry. In 2009, he received the President's Award for Sanskrit from the Government of India, and in 2010, he received the Padma Shri Award, also one of the highest awards from the Government of India. Professor Lawrence Cohen is a professor of social cultural anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of a book titled No Aging in India, a book on Alzheimer's disease, the body and the voice in time, and the cultural politics of senility. Presently, he is working on a book titled India Tonight, which examines homoerotic identification and representation in the context of political and market logics in urban North India. And he is also working on a collaborative project with Nancy Shepherd-Hughes titled The Other Kidney that engages the nature of immunosuppression and its accompanying global traffic in organs for transplant. Ranjani Mazumdar is an associate professor of cinema studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Her publications focus on urban cultures, popular cinema, gender, and the cinematic city. She is the author of Bombay Cinema, an archive of the city, and she is also a documentary filmmaker and a founding member of Media Storm, India's first women's film collective. Her documentaries include Delhi Diary 2001 on violence, memory, and the city, The Power of the Image, which is a television series that she co-directed on Bombay cinema, and Prisoner of Gender, which won the second prize at an international television documentary film festival. Her current research focuses on film in the 1960s, globalization and film culture, and the visual culture of film posters. Finally, Wendy Doniger is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor of the History of Religions at the University of Chicago's Divinity School. Her research and teaching interests revolve around two basic areas, Hinduism and mythology. Her many books have been published under the name Wendy Doniger O'Flaherty, which include Hindu Myths, a source book translated from the Sanskrit, the Rig Veda, an anthology, and the Laws of Manu. Under the name Wendy Doniger, her books include The Implied Spider, Politics and Theology in Myth, a new translation of the Kama Sutra, which came out in 2005, together with Sudhir Kakad, The Woman Who Pretended to Be Who She Was. She has some wonderful titles. And The Hindus, an Alternative History, which came out last year. In progress are a book on Hinduism and Faking It, Narratives of Circular Jewelry and Deceptive Women, and Horses for Lovers, Dogs for Husbands, which is a novel. This is just, I think, a very small selection of Professor Doniger's books. So without much further ado, I turn it over to Professor Pollock.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to Arian Mack and to Arjun Upadhyay for inviting me to participate in this distinguished enterprise and to ride my hobby horse with you this afternoon. Maybe it's more than a hobby horse. That's what I'm going to try to suggest for you this afternoon. It is indeed about a crisis in classical studies in India, but also globally. And what makes it, I think, more than a hobby horse is the fact that a lot depends on our capacity to read the classics and thereby to gain access to the past and to ways, perhaps alternative ways of being human. So something important is at stake here. Let me start with a tiny little anecdote. Some of you who read The Hindu, the South Indian press, will know some of the stories I'm about to tell you. But in 2004, after the general election, the DMK won a substantial victory in Tamil Nadu and was invited into the centers of power in Delhi as part of the coalition government. And one of the first demands the DMK government of Tamil Nadu raised with the center was the demand that Tamil be named a classical language. And indeed, very soon thereafter, for the first time, I think, in human history, a nation state declared a language to be classical. And that was in 2004, and you can imagine, if you've ever been in the South, that within a few weeks, the people in Karnataka, the people in Andhra, the people in Kerala, and other points decided also to petition the government that their language should be named classical languages. The story goes on. It's an incredible burlesque. If you search classical languages in the Hindu archive, you will come up with a whole range of highly diverting articles about this subject. But the thing I want to suggest to you today is that this debate is precisely the debate that India should not be having at the moment. There's something much, much graver at stake than this nominalist exercise that seems to have occupied ministers and politicians in the last 7 years. What is at stake, as I suggested at the very start, is the capacity to access what is actually the world's longest continuous multilingual literary tradition. When we lose this tradition, we lose something very powerful. Up till 1947, an important benchmark year to which I will return, up until 1947, India was graced by the presence of scholars of world-class attainments in the domain of classical studies. in virtually every regional tradition. This firmament of stellar intellectuals has disappeared almost totally. That's my purvapaksha, that's my thesis for today. And in fact, if I can put this in terms that I don't think are too alarmist, although I am known to be an extremist and an alarmist, somebody has to be, I would suggest, and I think there's evidence to show this, that within the next 2 generations in India, and I really mean South Asia, because the situation in Bangladesh, in Nepal, I don't know Sri Lanka so well, but certainly Pakistan is not dissimilar, so I'll say South Asia. Within 2 generations, or maybe the middle of the century, the number of people able to read and understand classical literature in South Asia will have reached a statistical 0. That's the claim I want to make. Now, when did I start? I have to keep my eye on the time. What I want to do for you today is just talk briefly about 4 aspects of this problem. The first is my hypothesis actually correct? Is there, who am I? India is a big place. South Asia is a huge place. What do I know about the crisis, and how dare I speak of it? I was glancing over the journal issue, and there's a lot of talk of crisis, even of blame. I am not interested in blaming anyone in India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka. I'm interested in calling attention to what I consider a existential threat in South Asia. But the question is there really such a threat? So that's the first thing I have to demonstrate to you. Second thing I want very briefly to do is talk about the etiology of this threat. Where did it come from? How did it come about? Why is there a crisis, if indeed there's a crisis? Very briefly, for the third, in some ways for me, the most important point, something that people like me, professional classicists, rarely talk about publicly. Why should we care? Who cares if there's a crisis? Who cares if it's all falling apart? Let it just die. There's a certain ethics of forgetting. What's the point? It's an argument that I think has to be made as forcefully as possible, and I'm not sure I will be able to do that beyond my own narrow limits, but that's one thing I want to talk about today as well. And finally, the big question, if there is a crisis, if we know how it came about, if we think it's important to address the crisis, how do we do that? Now, let me start by saying that India, I have a dear friend, Dipesh Chakrabarty, wrote a book called Provincializing Europe, and he begins the book, it's a sort of stagist critique of stagist visions of history. India is always in the waiting room of history, never emerging into modernity. I think India is now at the center of the table of history, the chief guest of history, and that in fact, as I was saying yesterday to some friends, the rest of the world is aspiring to the condition of India, for good or bad. And I think the crisis in the classics that India is confronting is in fact shared globally, with one exception, China, which I won't have time to talk about except very briefly. Let me put this more simply. I think the crisis in the classics is really a global problem. I don't have much time to demonstrate that to you today. If you open the New York Times, or any review of books, you will see a book on the crisis in the humanities. People have been crying about the crisis in the humanities ever since there were humanists. But something serious is happening these days. I urge you to go to the online humanities indicators for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and David Brinkley's account of what's happened to the humanities in the United States. 40% of the PhDs in the 70s were humanistic degrees. Now they're 8%. And of this 8%, a minute fraction are classical studies degrees, even in the biggest, broadest assessment of classical. So if you actually think for a moment of what that means, you have a very minute sliver of the American professoriate that has the responsibility of preserving 95% of human humanistic history. That's exactly what this is all about. I'm not saying that the humanists are not to blame, and I wish I could tell you my critique of comparative literature, but I don't have time to do that. But just to let it be known, and I'll be happy to elaborate on the statistics at some point. I did a little study of comparative literature, and it turns out, and I think I can sustain these statistics, that 95% of discussion in literature and comparative literature in the United States pertains to 3% of human literary history. That's a pretty astonishing thing. So we professionals have something to answer for here, but the bottom line is that in the United States, the attack on the humanities, or the humanities attack on itself is another way to put it, is dire, and the situation in Europe is really not much better. Once upon a time, there were Sanskritists galore in Germany and Holland and the UK. It's all virtually gone now. I go frequently to Collège de France, which at one time was the key place for the study of the secular study. That's how it was set up in the 16th century. The secular study of languages and texts. There is no one teaching classical Greek at the Collège de France, no one doing classical Chinese, no one doing classical Semitic studies, and the Sanskritists there will most certainly not be replaced. So the Collège de France, a sort of bellwether of Western European classical studies, is a very eloquent witness to the problem I'm talking about. Now, so you see, I'm trying to suggest that it really is a global problem with India in the vanguard. India is in the vanguard of this struggle or of this historical shift. Now, how do I actually make that claim to you? Statistics, if anyone's ever tried to gather statistics about education in India, it is extremely difficult. I have tried and I have failed. And so my data is really personal. It's the personal data of a person who's been traveling to India for a long, long time and who's actually run several literary projects in India that have tried to call upon local expertise over the last 25 years from across the domain. I mean, we're talking about a vast literary historical world here, from Assamese to Tamil to Urdu. I mean, it's an enormous archive, and trying to find people to access that archive has been an astonishing problem for me for many, many years. A couple of very brief anecdotes. Many of you will know the name Didi Kosambi, a hero of my youth. At his 100th anniversary, I was asked to write something about him. And the thing that I most poignantly realized when I was writing the chapter on Didi Kosambi in Sanskrit, how India has not produced another Didi Kosambi. There is nobody in India today who has the philological and critical, whatever the politics of the criticism may be, it doesn't matter, critical edge that Didi Kosambi brought. And there were a class of such people. For those who know anything about classical studies, P.V. Kane, Mysore Hiriana, S.K. Day, from across the subcontinent in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there were extraordinary scholars who wrote for a global audience in my particular area. That's all gone now. It is totally gone. I did a project about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. We actively sought the participation of scholars in South Asia to do a collective literary history. We could find nobody in Assamese. We could find nobody in Marathi. We could find nobody in Punjabi. For Bengali, we wound up with a political scientist, an extraordinary political scientist. But even in Bengali, you would think the capacity of a deep literary history in Bengali, from the Vaishnav Pads to Tagore, you would think that there would be. Well, you would think. But in fact, if you look, those capacities which, I mean, every Indian in the audience will know that his grandfather will tell me, my grandfather used to read this, my grandmother used to know this. That's all gone. Now, just real quickly, one last anecdote, because this is all anecdotal. One last anecdote. A couple of years ago, the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla held a conference with the title Crisis in the Classics, ? And they sent out letters to about 50 or 60 people in India and abroad, trying to find names of possible participants. Actually, in this article, in this journal, I reproduce some of the replies that were given to those requests for names. We wanted people who were teaching at a university, who had published something, and who had evinced a certain expertise in a classical language. The replies almost took on a formulaic character. Oh, I wish I could help you. You know, in Punjab, there's just nobody's interests are in Punjabi, nobody's interests are in old texts anymore. Oh, Marathi, yes, there was somebody several years ago, he's now retired, but there's nobody's. Persian. The point is that there were dozens of these sorts of responses that collectively suggest a profound malaise. That in the short time I've got to you is the data that I have to suggest that there was a very, very deep crisis. Let me give you one last example. We wanted to get somebody for classical Hindi. This is a so-called Rashtra Bhasha, classical Hindi. Classical Hindi is not taught at either of the great universities of Delhi today. This would be, in its exact historical parallel, this would be like saying, in Paris today, there is nobody teaching Molière or Corneille or Racine. That's exactly the historical parallel. The great recrudescence of classical literariness in early 17th century France is exactly parallel to what's happening in North India at this period. And there is nobody in Delhi, at JNU or Delhi University, teaching this. I think it's an eloquent example of the problem that I'm... Now, if you'll grant me that there's a crisis, and as I say, it is a huge world. I'm one chota person. how do I really, really know? And I would love to be contradicted by somebody in the audience who would tell me about all the great projects that have been started, of all the great journals that are publishing, all the great manuscript series that are publishing some of the 6 million manuscripts that lay unread and untouched in India. Somebody who would tell me about the monographs that scholars in India are publishing in university presses in Europe and the United States. Somebody who would tell me about journals that are required reading among Western scholars, as they used to be as close as 25 years ago. It is a blasted landscape. There are no journals I read anymore in India. I've never seen a book published by a classical Indian scholar at a university press in the United States, with one or two exceptions. Journal articles are almost never published by South Asian scholars. There are no major projects in classical humanities that have been undertaken since the completion of the great epic works in the 50s and 60s. But I would love to be contradicted or show where I'm missing. But if you grant me that there is something of a problem here, let me just keep my eye on the time. 5 minutes to go. 5 minutes to go. Well, then you must buy the journal. Huh? Let me see what I can do in 5 minutes. I'm going to forego the problem of origins. I think the reasons for the crisis are not all that far to be sought. India committed itself to science and technology, and there are other eloquent speakers who are dealing with the contemporary educational system. Absence of life chances. I don't think it's too difficult. I don't think it has anything to do with something like reservations, reservation policy. That's complete nonsense. Non-Brahmanism in the South had something to do with it. Islamophobia in the North certainly had something to do with the erosion of Persian Urdu. But let me pass over that and talk about my third point. Why should we care? I'd be happy to elaborate on this in the question and answer. I really have a very different vision of what you say, why is he talking about classics? What is this word classics? Well, by classics, I mean really anything written in India before 1800. 1800 is an important cutoff point. I mean, it's the coming of colonialism, it's the transformation of the literary imagination in India, it's the loss of access to what have suddenly become foreign languages for many traditions. But why do I say classics? This is an important point I do want to take a moment to talk about. I have a very perverse sense of what classics means. If you go through the history of what is a classic, the famous essay by Sainte-Beuve or T.S. Eliot, those texts that where there's kind of a universal moral theme. That is not for me what classics. Classics for me is in fact just the opposite. Classics for me is what is highly particular. Classics for me is what gives access to ways of being that are radically unfamiliar to us. That's what I take to be classical. And that's what I'm talking about in the crisis of the classics. I'm talking about our inability to have access to a range, to 3,000 years of some of the most significant monuments of human consciousness that might in some way tell us something about our existence. So classics has a peculiar salience for me. I think the study of classics produces a very special kind of non-instrumental, radical pedagogy, which I'd be happy to elaborate on. There is no correlation between class status and classics. In fact, you could argue, as Gramsci argued, that classics is in some ways the most radical kind of pedagogy. If we lose the classics, we lose our capacity for memory. And there are two aspects to this. One is the capacity to fight off the enemies of memory, the anti-historians, the enemies of history. If we lose the capacity to read those texts, we lose the capacity to fight for history. Secondly, we lose the capacity for radical critique, the kind of critique that, say, Ambedkar tried to inaugurate, but simply didn't have the tools to do. I think if we lose the classics, we lose, and this is my theme, generally speaking, we forego the possibility of acquiring new tools for living. I'm not a traditionalist. This is not about going back and revivifying some antiquity. It's about disrupting in a radical way the assumptions and preconceptions of the present, of what's possible for human beings. And of course, not last but not least, there is the very possibility of great beauty, which we might not otherwise have access to. Okay, I have to wrap this up, and let me just go to my final point. So I've told you in my Buddhist way that there is dukkha in the world. I've told you that there is a dukkha samudaya, that there's the arising of pain, and that there's a reason to block a dukkha nirodha. So then what is the marga here? What is the marga for this? Well, maybe we can talk about this in the, this is my easy way out, right? We'll talk about this in the question and answer. The state, I designed a program for the new Nalanda University, and I thought this was going to disappear completely, but apparently the Nalanda University is going to happen. Maybe the state, maybe private enterprise. I mean, consider the enlightened philanthropy of someone like Narayana Murthy and family, which has underwritten the creation of a series for classical texts, which will essentially be distributed almost for free among children in South Asia, 100 rupee paperback for some of the best scholarship on classical texts. Philanthropy, the state, collaborations between South Asian and U.S. or European groups, new programs like the Ambedkar Sanskrit Fellowship Program at Columbia. We can talk more. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, this is the degenerate world you're worrying about, and here it is with PowerPoint. And okay, can you hear me? I want to echo Shelley's thanks to Aryan and to Arjun. Seems to work. But fine. Yeah, thanks. And this is the most wonderful room I've ever given a paper in. Okay, this past month, Sathya Sai Baba, the famous, often controversial Hindu religious leader, died in a super specialty hospital complex not far from Bangalore that his organization had built as a presumptive gift to the masses. As Sai Baba was and remains a revered form of God for his many followers worldwide, it might be more accurate to follow those of his devotees who write and blog that only his material incarnate body expired in late April. Indian news media nonetheless paid close attention to the last days of this material body. Sai Baba was reported to be suffering from a sequential failure of body parts in Hindi ang. The English media often referred to his cause of death as multi-organ failure. It is not obvious what multi-organ failure is or what it does. Many of us in this room will die amid a cascade of failing organs culminating with the brain. In the essay of mine that Social Research has just published, I note that there has been a wave of deaths of prominent Indians over the past decade, similarly framed as multi-organ failure, including West Bengal Communist leader Jyoti Basu and rising BJP star PRAMOD, the latter shot by his own brother. In both these cases, the new medium of 24/7 news coverage in many languages allowed for an intense coverage of the clinic with hour-to-hour reports, not just of the prognosis of the prominent person, but of the prognosis of each of his or her involved organs. We are no longer in the waiting room memorialized in countless popular Indian films in which the operation is happening behind the door with the red warning light or sign, and all we eventually get to know is the physician's sovereign gesture as to whether, that's ahead, our loved one will live or die. We are expected, on the contrary, to know our parts, our organs. In Hindi and English newsprint archives covering the time of both Basu's and Mahajan's deaths, I found extensive supplementary features explaining to readers what each involved ang of the body does, a widespread and increasingly internet-mediated pedagogy of the organ, appearing at a time when the temporal organization of news and information frames death as a cascade of failing parts in real time. What is an ang today, and what is an organ? In the written essay, I try to think at some length about what a pedagogy of the body and of its parts might entail. This thinking comes out of a much larger long-term project, an accounting of the world that the globalization of organ transplantation brings into being. What I want to do with my time today is to outline some of the broader themes of this work, and then to link these to what I mean by the accusation of illiteracy and its corollary, the confusion of parts. Sathya Sai Baba's super specialty hospital is but one of thousands of large new tertiary and quaternary clinics built in India over the 1980s through the current decade. Long a regional center for high-end medical procedures, India in our time has capitalized on the formal rise of a medical tourism industry with elective surgeries and transplant procedures widely available. The mobile patients of this still expanding industry move along both millennia-old Indian Ocean circuits linking coastal Indian cities to Southeast Asia and the Middle East, and to newer circuits focused on Europe and in particular upon non-resident Indians abroad. Transplant surgery is intimately tied to the liberalization of the Indian economy. Hospitals early in the 1980s became a site for liberalized capital flows, and the new clinics often featured a kidney transplant unit as a guarantor of excellence and hypermodernity. By the 2000s, multiple organ systems became tied into the promotion of corporate medicine. There's a missing slide. We're going to have a... Okay, we don't need slides. This is the reason my PowerPoint doesn't work. The addition, where's... Okay. This is not the... let's just see if I can... Forgive me for 1 second. They're nice pictures. No, we're not going to... Okay. Okay. So no pictures. Sorry about that. We should switch back to the... It's not. Both powerful exposés... Okay. Okay, the situation linking the clinic to the unregulated flow of capital under emergent liberalization policy allowed medicine to emerge as a key site for money laundering. Both powerful exposés and unfounded rumors of the new so-called medical black money nexus traveled along the same 24/7 media circuits, providing the pedagogy of the organ. Organ transplantation has emerged as a simultaneous figure of clinical hypermodernity and of monstrous corruption, both linking India to the world within particular economies of scale. Thus, in his 2010 over-the-top novel, The Scalpel, which is a must-read, New Delhi-based cardiologist and novelist H.S. Rissim writes about a super-specialty hospital in the capital that contains within its gleaming towers a clinical underworld where regional migrants and local children are kidnapped for organs, and international criminals and terrorists, untraceable by the CIA and the Indian RAW, utilize hospital rooms like a private hotel. The emergence of the transplant clinic and of the monstrous accounts that have dogged its Indian incarnation depended on more than post-Cold War liberalization of the international financial system. It depended centrally on a molecule, one we know clinically as cyclosporin, which spent its formative years as the intellectual property of the Swiss-based Sandoz Corporation, later Novartis. Over a decade in which the Bombay and later the Chennai-based film industries were turning away from Kashmir towards Switzerland in staging their extradiegetic affects of the couple form, otherwise known as film songs, a Swiss molecule was remaking available accounts of life and its future for many in India and worldwide. To explain the world historical importance of this molecule is far beyond the time I have today. Briefly, it functions as an immune system suppressant. The dawn of the 20th century, experimental clinicians figured out how to suture arteries together, enabling vascular surgery and potentially realizing the dream that the late 19th century knew as organotherapy, the literal consumption of the organs of others to extend life. But in animal experiments, kidney grafts failed, despite the new mechanical possibilities of surgery, for reasons we would in hindsight understand as immunological, the body's rejection of difference. Similarly, in humans, successful kidney surgeries required identical twins. The expanded medicine of two world wars, which developed first blood typing and then tissue typing as military necessities to allow for the transfusion and skin grafting of soldiers eviscerated by new technologies of war, made possible a new medicine of recognition in the post-war period. With tissue typing, if only one could test enough people whose organs were available to one would be likely to find a match. In other words, unlike blood types, for many organs, one would have to test a far larger catchment of persons to find someone with immunologically similar enough tissues. Such a population, both large enough and critically available enough, did not exist. It came into being with a convergence of factors: the invention and widespread use of the respirator machine for polio victims, the building of highways, and the emergence of a mass youth culture of speed and automobility in North America and Western Europe, the crash victims of this new culture of speed being kept barely alive on the respirators, and this new kind of bare life being redefined as brain death at my alma mater, Harvard Medical School. With brain death and the wait list, the massive scale needed to find someone similar enough was achievable, at least in North America and Western Europe. Persons dying of organ failure could supplement their bodies and extend their lives. In the rest of the world, the infrastructure for organizing the scale of bodily recognition was less readily achievable, and the affects enabling committing one's barely alive accident victim children to the clinic as a gift of life to unknown others made little biomoral sense. Cyclosporine changed the situation by scaling down tissue movement. Once the immune system was suppressed, one did not need to search among so many persons to find a good enough organ. What good enough could be had changed. The scale of organ availability began to approach the scale of blood availability. Thus, clinics could begin to experiment with techniques of recruitment they previously used for blood. In most of India, both familial and commercial organ donation followed patterns of familial and commercial blood donation once Sandoz began to market and distribute cyclosporin in Asia. By terming these techniques of tissue recruitment experimental, we stress the uncertain and open-ended efforts of clinic managers to render persons loving enough, religious enough, marginal enough, or desperate enough into sources of available tissue. There is no single pattern, no single story of the Indian organ. Cyclosporin, in reducing the scale of tissue movement, opened up medicine into a million experiments now, as it were. The most notable early 1980s experiments were centered on private hospitals in Madras and Bombay and involved the emergence of brokered markets and organs centered on urban slums. For Bangalore, which saw a similar creation of new hospitals, but which lacked the shipping and industrial history of the other cities and the same concentration of labor power in slums, clinicians and their brokers turned to indebted farmers and rural weavers. I have written at length on the relations between debt and tissue that emerge across this range of situations and how they get differently gendered. Women as the primary urban tissue vendors, men as the primary rural vendors, and I will return to the gendered experience of the organ in a bit. A second feature of the emergent experimental situation was its persistent publicity and audit. Popular films and several language cinemas followed quickly upon the first 1980s advertisements in the wake of cyclosporin and the new clinic, the ads placed in classified sections of newspapers by families searching for a donor. The subsequent films focused upon the inclusion of the surgical operation into the melodramatic conditions of sacrifice by which relations cared for one another. Thus, in the 1985 Hindi film Saab, a brother sells his kidney to a rich man to raise money so his sister can get married. Unlike the dominant urban experiments in Bombay and Madras of the time, the films masculinized the sacrifice of the kidney. By audit as a feature of the situation, I mean that journalists, the police, state officials, international health, development, and rights-based organizations, and academics all turned to the early reports of an Indian kidney as obvious material for problematization. The dominant currency of this problematization became the scandal, its dominant image, the telltale scar. Very quickly, this variable situation of scandal and publicity produced a kind of double, an experience of the mobile organ among the vast majority of persons who were never likely to see the inside of a transplant clinic. I began thinking about a future project on the kidney when I began hearing in Benares in North India, when I was working there on a different project on AIDS in the early 1980s, the kidney entering everyday conversation, early 1990s, sorry, the kidney entering everyday conversation around what we might term a horizon of possibility. Young men, in calling attention to uncertainty in their future, and in particular to the unlikelihood that their fathers could adequately settle them, joked that maybe I could sell a kidney. This kind of organs talk that emerged in the wake of the publicity of the transplant operation as a species both of hope and of the limit to hope has deep reference preceding the experiments enabled by liberalization and cyclosporine. Wendy Doniger some years ago wrote a beautiful essay on mythological antecedents to the figure of the transplant, and I and others have wrestled with the apparent resonance of organs talk with the writing of anthropologist McKim Marriott on what he termed biomorality in village India. In the essay I wrote for Social Research, I wrestled with a particular feature of organs talk that reanimates the historical past, not of the archives of Sanskrit cosmopolitanism, but of 19th century colonial governance and 20th century decolonization and nation building. Let me, in closing, briefly allude to the contours of the argument, and if you are intrigued or appalled, I would be grateful if you could look at the longer article and offer feedback. In the essay, I open with an eye hospital in contemporary Chennai, built in the shape of a giant eye, and reflect on the role of the icon or image of the organ in the organization of contemporary medicine. I refer to ubiquitous signboards or hoardings for medical clinics across India that feature pictures of body parts and cite brief interviews with clinic managers who point out the obvious, that these signs are intended for illiterates who cannot read. This idea that the masses of the clinically relevant population are functionally illiterate, if they suffer, in other words, from a problem of recognition that troubles their access to rationalized health care, was frequent in these interviews. The organ appears at this site of misrecognition. It marks the presumptive condition of the mass body in its exile from the proper knowledge of language and thus the proper knowledge of things in themselves. I turn to the organ as a sign because of a repeated event in my Chennai-based fieldwork. An accusation of illiteracy involving an apparent confusion of organs. Doctors in a dialysis ward at a government hospital, a ward where patients and their families exchanged information about the varied costs and risks of familial and commercial kidney donation, of cyclosporine, and of the operation itself, several times told me, the doctors, that, quote, these illiterates confuse their organs. The accusation of confusion came up when I reported to them a conversation I had with a 30-ish man in a neighborhood well studied by journalists and academics looking for a kidney story, the man who was worried that the kidney operation would make him sterile or worse, impotent, some kind of eunuch. Patients are often confusing these operations, nephrectomy versus either vasectomy or castration. The doctors said they confuse their parts, their kidneys, and their testicles. When I first heard this accusation, I thought of a particular metonymic figure in Hindi for edible offal, gurde kapure, kidneys and testicles. To the extent one buys, prepares, and consumes gurde kapure, one page left. It's as a single item for those who might consume them, the question of confusion would not arise. The doctors, however, were pointing to an apparent and incorrect act of substitution, one organ or one operation for another, as a feature of the illiterate mass as it encounters the clinic. In Levi-Strauss's version of the Jacobsonian terms, the problem with illiterates is they turn metonym into metaphor. In the essay, I argue that this question of metonym and metaphor and the accusation against the mass directs us towards two moments. The first is a way I argue we might want to recast 19th century colonial debates over native pedagogy. Sir Henry Maine famously argued at Presidency College against those who claimed that Indians only did well in their civil service exams because they used techniques of cramming and rote memorization. Maine noted that empire required nothing less than rethinking what knowledge was. We must amass enormous amounts of knowledge to rule the world. We need technologies like lists and the rote memorization. We should not presume these neuter our thinking. In my reframing, Maine suggests that empire requires metonymy, that is, it requires the memorization of the world as a series of lists of things, not substitutable the one for the other. The illiterate body stands in tension with the requirements of this metonymic order. The second moment is the last page, emergence of the clinical form of the health camp, specifically the surgical camp in the late 19th century with cataract procedures, and its redeployment in the 20th as part of the coercive apparatus of family planning. Cataract camps were fortistes avant la lettre. Surgery was reduced to a series of simple procedures to treat mass populations quickly and efficiently. The camp becomes a key site in the creation of a mass body. The limit to camp's efficiency, particularly under the demands of international health governance and its quanta of targets of bodies to be operated on, as in the emergency, is iatrogenesis, that is medical failure. Infections multiply, nerves, tendons, vessels may be cut. One operation becomes another. The medicine of the mass, the camp, produces a condition people can only capture as metaphor, not metonymy, one operation or organ becoming another. I'm struck by the accusation of confusion in Mystery's novel A Fine Balance, in which doctors yell at frightened men for confusing their operations, men who are trying to make sense of a clinical regime whose side effects are multiplying. In my own work, men and women differently brought family planning into conversations on the kidney operation, confusing their organs as the doctors sometimes had it. This paper is part of an effort to be able to hear them. What then a multi-organ failure? I'm not fully sure. The blow-by-blow reportage of death that new media provides reanimates the metonymic sequence of organs. To make sense of the death of great men and of gods, we need to begin by asking what organs are and what they become. Thanks.
Okay, this is a highly abridged version of my published essay, and you really need to read the published essay to get the larger sense of the argument. Fear, as many suggest, is a response to perceptions of danger that penetrate social memory, thrives on ambiguities, and generates states of paranoia. The fear associated with the memory of explosions, bomb blasts, and other such cataclysmic events is partly linked to our inability to comprehend, systematize, and judge these sites of conflict. The number of times we hear about an event and its magnitude shapes our relationship to paranoia, and technologies of information have played a pivotal role in making media events rule our present. Television news spectaculars transform traumatic events in the world into narratives of suspense and surprise. This is now fundamental to the way the media functions, and it is here that conspiracy, as a form of narrative with dramatic explanatory power, becomes a convenient intervention, opening out historical wounds to a parade of detail, documents, plans, security discourses, and technology. In the recent past, conspiracy has entered the terrain of Bombay cinema to dissect and produce the illusion that the truth can be known once the gaps are filled up. This paper looks at 3 films from Bombay which take the issue of terrorism to mediate the landscape of conspiracy, surveillance, and the city. The films are Anurag Kashyap's Black Friday, Rajkumar Gupta's Amir, and Neeraj Pandey's A Wednesday. These 21st century films refer to various terrorist attacks of the last 2 decades and work with an investigative cartography, staging the city through narratives cluttered with evidentiary details, an aggressive marking and arranging of information, and a constant presence of the visual media as the ultimate arbiter of knowledge. The films open out events through reenactments and precision-style unraveling, and in this process, a mobile script is carved out to mediate the relationship between paranoia and citizenship. Central to the unraveling of conspiracy is the appropriation of obsessive surveillance techniques in the cinematic language of looking, mapping, and processing information. Anurag Kashyap's film Black Friday, based on the Bombay bomb blasts of 1993, was perhaps the first to deploy the structure of a conspiracy film. Largely committed to reproducing the structure of the book authored by S. Hassan Zaidi, Black Friday uses real names and places. This became the primary reason for a long-drawn delay in its release due to legal worries that the film could influence a 13-year-old trial into the synchronized bomb attacks. That trial ended in September of 2006, and the film was released soon after. At one level, the film is a revenge narrative which shows Tiger Memon and Dawood Ibrahim, both underworld figures, as the kingpins behind the planned attacks. At another level, we have Badshah Khan, one of the prime accused in the conspiracy, who is manipulated emotionally to join Tiger Memon's gang to participate in the blasts after his working life got destroyed by the riots. The investigation of the conspiracy is led by Rakesh Maurya on behalf of the police. It is in the course of the investigation that we stumble upon Badshah Khan, through whom the entire conspiracy is laid out for the spectator. At one level, this is a conventional police procedural form, where witness accounts are generated to tightly structure information and details. At another level, the movement from scenes of interrogation at the police headquarters to dramatic detailing across the city deploys the aesthetics of surveillance. As the narrative unfolds, we get access to a powerful terrorist network, moving with a camera that literally operates like an X-ray machine, scripting a desire for social and spatial control. In the course of this journey, Islamic signage is liberally deployed. We encounter the people reading the namaz. There is conversation about Ramzan. The sound of Qawwali occasionally plays on the soundtrack, and mosques dot the city. The X-ray vision, as I use it here, is a way of identifying the camera as penetrating through the multiple layers of the city. An example of this is the testimony of Asghar Muqaddam, Tiger Memon's manager. Muqaddam has clearly been tortured by the police. He sits there only in his underpants, narrating the actual planting of the bombs. How do you play this?
Here. This one. Click on this one.
This one?
I'd rather not, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry. Can you continue talking while we try to troubleshoot this from up there?
The clip, they have to see the clip now.
I know. Is there more you can talk about while I take it upstairs?
Okay.
Okay. No.
No.
I'm going to take this upstairs.
Anyway, the sequence, if some of you have seen Black Friday, it's a sequence where the police officer is interrogating all these suspects, and one of the suspects is now speaking in front of the officer and giving him information about how they planted bombs all across the city. And suddenly the voice is dislodged from the body, and the voice starts traveling all across the city, and we get information about where and why and how they planted all these bombs. And it's this narrative across the space of the city which gives us some sense of a new network and a new plan of the city that the terrorists inhabit. And that's how we get a vision of the city. And that's the sequence I wanted to show you. I will continue now. In case this thing works, hopefully we'll see the sequence. Muqaddam's confessions showcases the city through the terrorist plan. Neighborhoods are named, strategies described, and the planners are placed at the heart of the city. Kashyap was influenced by the strategies adopted in sting operations and used hidden cameras for his shooting. The ability to move through a dense landscape of architectural and human mass, television and radio technology, lavatories and garbage to unearth the men behind the conspiracy marked Black Friday's X-ray vision. Each testimony offers an account of the conspiracy, and as we move through the film, the voice is dislodged from the body of the speaker, independently producing information on global financial transactions, RDX, smuggling, the underworld, Islam, Pakistani camps, and more. The fascination for the details of the conspiracy and the step-by-step account of the plan accessed via testimonies produced after torture reaffirms faith in this conduct of the police. All uncertainties are ironed out, and detection is accorded a special place. The X-ray vision, with its powerful intensity, makes the prisoners turn their life into a form of public spectacle and by default become accomplices in the surveillance tactics of the police, the filmmaker, and the spectators. If Black Friday directly engages with the conspiracy behind the 1993 blast, Aamir is located in the present, in a world that we can now refer to as post-1993. Directed by Rajkumar Gupta, Aamir is the story of a non-resident Indian doctor from London named Aamir Ali, who arrives in Bombay to meet his family. At the airport, he experiences discrimination at the hands of a customs officer who gets his bags checked 3 times. If his name was Amar, not Aamir, would the officer do the same, asks Aamir. When Aamir exits from the airport, he is drawn into a nightmarish experience in which he is the sole good Muslim up against a hidden and powerful Islamic network in the city. Aamir's family has been kidnapped, and for their release, Aamir must perform a role for the terrorists and plant a bomb in a crowded bus. The moment Aamir steps out of the airport, a cell phone is handed over to him by 2 unknown men on a bike. Thereafter, he is constantly tracked by an ominous voice on the phone. While Aamir can only hear the voice, we as spectators can see the anonymous caller on screen, framed in expressionist-style shadows, the face revealed only partially. The protagonist is trapped by the cell phone, his every movement watched and communicated via all Muslims who have the phone in their possession. We follow a bewildered Aamir through a decrepit urban landscape as he tries to make sense of all the instructions given to him by the voice on the phone. Video images of Aamir's kidnapped family are revealed to him on the screen of the cell phone. The film plays with the ring of the phone throughout, creating a soundscape of cellular technology, the ominous threatening voice of the principal kingpin, and the ambience of the traffic. The city is overwhelmingly under surveillance, not by the state, but by the Muslim terrorists. They possess the all-seeing eye and a network of committed members who are working towards a revenge on the system. In establishing the network, the filmmaker accesses spaces of Bombay through 2 stereotypes of Muslims in South Asia, that of food and filth, both deployed to convey the emotive charge of disgust. In his philosophical treatise on disgust, Winfried Menninghaus writes, "The fundamental schema of disgust is the experience of a nearness that is not wanted. An intrusive presence, a smell or taste is spontaneously assessed as contamination and forcibly distanced." Gupta plays out this logic of disgusting nearness by forcing Aamir, and by the same logic the spectator, to confront the city's squalor, identified in the film with the Muslim community. The form of observation is decidedly tactile, with Aamir forced to walk through sites where he can smell, hear, and touch that which is perceived as disgusting. As we watch in horror and fascination, a parade of stereotypes unfold on screen. There are some moments that remain more troubling than others. The most troubling sequence, however, showcases Aamir's walk across a butcher's alley, holding a red suitcase with the bomb. A song plays on the soundtrack, which is intercut with close-ups of raw meat being chopped. The cold faces of men with their cloth caps are placed behind this line of chopped meat. The walk is stylized, and the association of butchers and butchery with a community is made quite directly. I've described the sequence to you. I wanted to show the sequence. This sequence relies on the simultaneous ability to repel, captivate, and enthrall the spectator. Amir's director Rajkumar Gupta expressed no qualms in playing with such feelings of disgust. Gupta wanted to show Amir's isolation from the larger community and the use of primitivist iconography to distinguish between the educated Muslim and the others seemed important to him. This marking of locations inhabited by the Muslims in Amir produces space as diseased and terrifying through a carefully crafted geography of filth, decay, and garbage. The methods adopted for such a strategy were quite inventive. Alphonse Roy, a wildlife photographer, was hired to shoot for the film. Roy drew on his own skills and used telephoto lenses from a distance where the crowd could not see the camera. Roy used 2 cameras, one for the close-ups and one for the long shots. This allowed him to carve out Bombay's urban blight as well as showcase the despair writ large on Amir's face, creating the desired field of affect. It was this combination of the unself-conscious crowd not knowing that a camera was looking at them with a demoralized Amir caught in a network of surveillance that generated a terrifying experience of fear. Perhaps the biggest fear today is the fear of insecurity, which results in the endless pursuit of protection and the search for security. The mapping of space in Amir is paradoxical. The surveillance mechanism appears to be in place, but it is in the hands of the Muslim terrorists. They can see and track, navigate and plan, terrorize and be ubiquitously present. This is where the technology of vision meets the evil of terrorism, defining and marking space as we move through Bombay's bylanes. Like Amir, our Wednesday deals with one day in the life of Bombay, and the sequence of events gathers intensity in a narrative that showcases the point of view of both a police officer and a common man who takes to vigilante action. An ordinary man sick of his life of fear decides to take the law into his own hands. Imagining himself as a vigilante, this unnamed common man, played by Nasiruddin Shah, challenges the cops to a game in which the ultimate targets are the jailed terrorists who, according to him, continue to operate from their prison. The cops do not seem to have an adequate plan to fight terrorism, and so this common man decides to act. He settles down with his cell phones, SIM cards, and a laptop on the roof of a half-constructed building to proceed with a plan. It soon transpires that the common man himself wants the militants dead and masterminds blasts to have them killed. The cops bypass the law in an extra-constitutional move to hand over the militants and the common man at the end of the film talks about the plight of the ordinary citizen. Unlike Amir and Black Friday, our Wednesday does not take us through the alleys of the city. Instead, the view of the city is deliberately refracted through surveillance technologies, the television, and the police headquarters. Black Friday is an investigative return to an event. Amir is the step-by-step chronicling of a hapless victim's journey across Bombay's dense neighborhoods. The street-level view, so central to these films, is largely absent in A Wednesday, which draws on the stylistic features of the Hollywood conspiracy film much more to chart out the simultaneous unfolding of spaces linked to power. A panoramic view of the city can be seen from the rooftop, where the common man sits with all his gadgets. This view of the city is dramatically shot to make him appear like a messiah figure out to rescue the city. The events unfold in compressed time, filled with action, suspense, and excitement. This common man communicates through his internet and cell phone and is in touch with the television reporter, the chief of police, and the police officer escorting the militants. Several spaces and people are drawn into this loop of action. The chief minister, the truck carrying the terrorists, the TV station, the police station, and a highly technologized war room at the police station. There is a communication network established between these spaces through the relay of phone conversations as we move at a pace across different sites. The corridors of power are depicted quite literally, generating a vision of the city that is refracted through the world of the police, the media, informants, and state functionaries. Surveillance, writes Mackenzie Wark, is only one element of an integrated form of vectoral power. There are two kinds of vector technologies, one that moves physical objects and one that moves information. The movement from one point to another under specific conditions is crucial to vector technology, which ultimately translates into the ability to order the things one perceives. Vector power depends on the quantitative and qualitative transformation of perceived spaces of the world into a resource that is then deployed to order the movement of resources in that world. What emerges in the process is a new world, a plan that can be drawn on a map. In A Wednesday, we see this attempt to create a new vision of Bombay through a careful relay of bodies and information. As the common man maps a circuit across different spaces through the movement of people in positions of power, the police, the TV crew, and the terrorists, vectoral power combines with the panoptical vision of the city from the rooftop. This attempt at a transcendental position occupied by the common man structures the morality of the film. He is neither Hindu nor Muslim. The common man's worldview is supposedly the vision behind the film. The technologies responsible for the flow of information operate like a roving surveillance machine, and the pathologies linked to the experiences of a high-speed society are foregrounded in the imagination of the film. The role of technology and new media in the channeling of fear is palpable in all three films. The rhetorical strategy of Black Friday is aided by the conscious use of the television as an information machine. Television news is placed within the narrative world as both image and sound, operating as a knowledge structuring device. Spectators are shown watching TV for news on the riots and the blasts. Its recurring presence in the film operates as a heuristic device, drawing our attention to a highly charged soundscape where evidence, causality, and motivation are understood through certain techniques. The constant sound of the news also functions as a unifying device, acting as an imaginary bond. If the internet and cell phone form the main thread for the staging of action in A Wednesday, then in Amir, the network that generates the narrative loop is the cell phone. These objects of audiovisual knowledge operate as uncanny mediums without which the films cannot tell their story. At one level, they are necessary objects that mark the time, the structure, and the unfolding of events. At another level, they generate fear, paranoia, and the uncertainties of life. All three films produce visual and sensory knowledge as they map the city of Bombay. In this urban cartography, the signs of globalization emerge not from the display of lifestyle images and consumption, but through the overwhelming presence of communication technologies. While all three films pose a counter-globalizing cartography, they mediate terror through realist strategies of representation, drawing on the repertoire of the stylistic devices deployed by news programs, reality TV, surveillance cameras, and police procedurals. The resultant archive is one in which the urban landscape emerges as a site taken over by Muslims desperately in need of social control. Terror in all the films becomes a communication strategy, a social fact that alters our sense of place. Viewers are drawn into a cartographic mapping of sites coded by violence, sites that perform their backwardness, their decay, and their crumbling ruin. We are then positioned to speculate about the history of the city. Bombay is presented as a space that demands action on itself, a strategy of cleansing that must first understand the truth about its decay. This is a city deeply affected by the archive of memory associated with the demolition of the Babri Masjid. The spiral of events that followed the demolition opened the city's subterranean geography for discussion, speculation, and intervention. The 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York forms a memory archive that has made us into what Marita Sturken refers to as the tourists of history. Through kitsch and consumerist products, the Twin Towers circulate, feeding contemporary paranoia and fear. The archive of memory linked to the demolition of the Babri Masjid and the bomb blast that followed find two different articulations in Bombay cinema. The first is the melodramatic form, dealing with the emotional texture of conflict, division, and loss, as in films like My Name is Khan. The second is the kind of cinema I have discussed here, where cinematic technology colludes to produce the desire for surveillance and spatial control, drawing spectators into a new way of navigating Bombay. The obsessive translation of a complex situation into a cartography of space, conspiracy, and fear becomes highly problematic as the overwhelming desire to control the city and its Muslims comes to the fore in all three films. Thank you. I'm very sorry about the technology.
Yes, thank you very much. I prefer to sit than to stand. A pervasive and often violent moral policing has taken over parts of the Indian world today. A typical instance of this occurred in 2007 when a 23-year-old student of fine arts at Baroda University, who had previously received awards for his work, mounted an exhibition for other students and staff. One painting entitled Durga Mate was of a nude woman attacking with a trident, the weapon of the god Shiva, a baby issuing from her womb. A group of activists, the ultra-nationalist exponents of Hindutva, whom I call Hindu twats, who advocate a sanitized spiritual form of Hinduism, vandalized the exhibition and roughed up the artist. The police stood by and then arrested not the vandals, but the artist. Students and spokespersons of the Indian art community held protests throughout India, claiming that the closing of the exhibition was a direct assault on the rights of freedom of expression. The protest against the Baroda University artist was one of a number of campaigns against artists and writers who linked Hindu deities with sexuality. In 1996, the Hindutva people began terrorizing M.F. Hussain for his paintings of naked Hindu goddesses. In 2006, after death threats and legal cases, Hussain, whom many regard as India's greatest living artist, and who was then 91 years old, was forced into exile and now lives in Dubai, or did so at the time of my last writing. These perpetrators of these assaults often cast blame for obscenity on Western influence on the people whom they censor, while ironically many of their own actions closely resemble censoring frenzies in the United States. But the Indian incidents are better seen as part of a separate logic of Hindu Puritanism, which has a long history of its own. When a group of students and the students at Baroda University who attempted to stage a protest demonstration against these assaults organized an exhibition of photographs taken from the explicitly erotic sculptures that adorn the temples at Khajuraho, built between 900 and 1100 CE in Madhya Pradesh. In choosing Khajuraho, they were making an implicit historical statement. Namely, the art heritage of India is rich in erotic themes, of which the images of the Khajuraho temples are a famous example. What happened to that tradition? How did India get from there to the scandal in Baroda? Erotic religious imagery is as old as Hinduism. The earliest Hindu sacred text, the Rig Veda, about 1500 BCE, revels in the language of both pleasure and fertility. The Upanishads that followed a few centuries later analogized the Vedic oblation of butter into the fire to the act of sexual procreation. The worshiper, in a sexual embrace with his wife, imagines each part of the act as a part of the ritual of the oblation, while presumably anyone making the offering into the fire could also imagine each action as its sexual parallel. Sensuality continued to keep its foot in the door of the house of religion throughout the history of India. But the Upanishads also introduced into India the concept of the two paths, one the path of family, life, society, and children, the other the path of renunciation, solitary meditation, and asceticism. And although asceticism always remained alive and well and living in India, householders continued to obey the command to be fruitful and multiply. The tension between the two paths, on the one hand, the violent, sacrificial, materialistic, sensual, and potentially addictive path of worldliness, and on the other, the nonviolent, vegetarian, ascetic, spiritual, and controlled path of renunciation, was sometimes expressed as the balance between bourgeois householders and homeless seekers, or between traditions that regarded karma, the accumulated record of good and bad deeds, as a good or a bad thing, respectively. The tension remains in the Tantras, a large body, this is kind of a gallop through Indian history in 2 minutes, a large body of text composed between about 650 and 1800 CE, the Tantras, which propose strikingly transgressive ritual actions violating all the taboos of conventional Hinduism, such as drinking wine and drinking menstrual blood, eating meat, and engaging in sexual activity with forbidden women. These tantras thus collapsed the Upanishadic metaphor, saying that the ritual sexual act is not just like a ritual as it is in the Upanishads, but is itself a ritual, the equivalent of making an offering into the fire. Other tantras, however, situated within the anti-erotic tradition of Hinduism, insisted that the ritual instructions were never intended to be followed literally, but were purely symbolic. They argued that wine really meant a meditational nectar, that flesh meant the tongue of the practitioner, and that the sexual act stood for the supreme essence. This was a very early form of censorship, and a very mild form, for it merely proposed an alternative anti-erotic interpretation of the text, but did not attempt to muzzle the other erotic interpretation. The erotic tradition continued to thrive in Hinduism. Many poems to gods in the medieval devotional tradition of bhakti imagine the god as a lover, often an unfaithful lover, and depict the relationship with all the sensual details of good erotic poetry. In addition to these religious texts that incorporated eroticism, there were more worldly texts that treated the erotic tout court, of which the Kama Sutra, composed in North India, probably in the 3rd century CE, is the most famous. There's nothing remotely like it even now, and for its time it was astonishingly sophisticated. It was already well known in India at a time when the Europeans were still swinging in trees, culturally and sexually speaking. The Kama Sutra's ideas about gender are surprisingly modern. It discusses the fellatio technique of the closeted man of the third nature, that is, a man who had sex with men, in considerable sensual detail, in the longest consecutive passage in the text describing any physical act, and with what might even be called gusto. It also reveals attitudes towards women's education and sexual freedom that are strikingly more liberal than those of other texts in ancient India, or in many cases in contemporary India. The Kama Sutra was a revolutionary document for women and for people of the third nature. It exerted a profound influence on subsequent Indian literature, particularly in court life and in the privileged, classless society that it describes at great length. But at the same time, the texts of Hindu religious law, with their deep suspicion of women and eroticism, retained their stranglehold on much of Hindu society. And then came the British. The Kama Sutra plays almost no role at all in the sexual consciousness of contemporary Indians, in part because it is known in both India and Europe almost entirely through the seriously flawed English translation by Sir Richard Francis Burton. A connoisseur of eroticism and Arabic as well as Indian literature, he published the first English translation of the Kama Sutra in 1883, a time when the Hindus, cowering under the scorn of Protestant proselytizers, wanted to sweep it under the Upanishadic rug. Burton's main contribution was the courage and determination to publish the work at all. He was the Larry Flint of his day. To get around the censorship laws, Burton set up an imaginary publishing house, the Kama Shastra Society of London and Benares, with printers said to be in Benares or Cosmopoly. They were, of course, in a London basement. But Burton's translation missed the entire point about same-sex eroticism because he renders third nature as eunuch throughout. Why did Burton make such an error? He may have used the word eunuch in its broader sense to designate not a guardian in the harem, but a man who had been castrated for one reason or another. Or he may have confused the men of the third nature with the hijras, castrated transvestites who function as male prostitutes in India today and are often called eunuchs, though there is no evidence of their existence at the time of the Kama Sutra. But I think it most likely that Burton's eunuchs are simply a matter of Orientalism, the depiction of Orientals as simultaneously oversexed and feminized. The word eunuch was bandied about loosely in British writings about the Orient, conveying a vague sense of sexual excess, cruelty, and impotence. and it infected Burton's translation of the Kama Sutra too. This next section is called Detumescence under the British. Though many of the British in India, particularly at the start in the 18th century, were, like Burton later on, appreciative of Indian eroticism, the puritanical Protestant ministers who evangelized India after 1813 loathed the eroticism of the temples, the temple dancers, the erotic excesses of the god Krishna, whom one Supreme Court ruling from 1862 accused of, quote, tinging the whole system of Hinduism with the strain of carnal sensualism, of strange transcendental lewdness, end quote. It's a great phrase, transcendental lewdness. These were, after all, the Victorians who were not amused by the copulating couples on the walls of the temples at Khajuraho. The officers and missionaries under the British Raj depicted all forms of what they regarded as oriental excess, all those arms, all those heads, all those wives, as despicable. The fraction of Hinduism that appealed to Protestant evangelical taste at all was firmly grounded in the other path of Hinduism, the philosophical renunciant path. Scholars have noted a pattern in which colonized people take on the mask that the colonizer creates in the image of the colonized, mimicking the colonizer's perceptions of the colonized. Many highly placed Hindus so admired their colonizers that in a kind of colonial and religious Stockholm syndrome, they swallowed the Protestant line themselves and not only gained a new appreciation of those aspects of Hinduism that the British approved of, such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, but became ashamed of those aspects that the British scorned, erotic sculptures on temples, temple dancers. Following the British lead, such Hindus largely wrote off the dominant strain of Hinduism that celebrated the passions of the gods. The highly anglicized Indian elite developed new forms of Hinduism heavily influenced by British Protestantism. Hinduisms that jettisoned much of the worldly and erotic path of Hindu polytheism, doctrines, dogmas, rituals, books, oral traditions, and temples, in order to extract a universal essence of spirituality. This movement eventually led to the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal or universal Dharma that is embraced by many Hindus to this day and that presides over the censorship of art, film, literature, and social behavior. The British line, even after its official death in India in 1947, dealt a blow to Indian freedom of expression through the Film Censor Board, which from the early 1950s implemented a policy basis that had roots among the British, who had worried more about sedition than about sex. And here I'm indebted to Arjun Appadurai not only for inviting me to join this very interesting convocation of scholars, but actually for telling me a lot about the modern period that I didn't really know. Like Professor Pollock, I'm really a classicist masquerading here, but these updated instances are very interesting indeed. The Film Censor Board's concern for visual pedagogy, nationalism, and publicity broadcast a shadow that extended over Indian visual arts and literature, as well as film. Hindu attitudes to sexuality were further confused by the very public and very contradictory sexuality of the man who was one of the most important Hindus of the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi's insistence on celibacy among his disciples caused difficulty for some of them, as did his habit of sleeping beside girls young enough to be called jailbait in the United States, to test and or prove his own celibate control. This practice of his drew not so much upon the Upanishadic and ascetic traditions, which were the source of many of Gandhi's practices, as upon the hydraulic tantric techniques of internalizing power, indeed creating quasi-magical powers by first stirring up the sexual energies and then withholding semen. It's a hydraulic model of bringing power into yourself from a stimulus such as sleeping beside a lovely young girl and then not expelling it. Gandhi was a one-man model of the perennial Hindu attempt to deal with sexuality by driving with one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake. In the 19th and 20th centuries, liberal Indian intellectuals who noticed the shift in attitudes to Hinduism's erotic past from appreciation to embarrassment tended to explain contemporary Hindu prudery in terms of power and patronage from the past. They said, erotic literature had been the creation of poets and princes, and as lascivious Hindu despots had given way to fanatical Mughal overlords, the patronage on which erotic literature depended had withered and died. And then, the argument went on, then came the British missionaries adding insult to injury. Thus, nationalists blamed India's sexual conservatism on an unholy combination of imposed Muslim religiosity and imported British Victorianism. And the history of the Muslim period is what I've left out, but that's in the published version. But trust me. There is some truth in that general historical argument, but it has three serious flaws. First, it ignores the enthusiasm for the erotic arts on the part of many Muslim rulers who had textbooks of Indian erotic arts and religious texts translated from Sanskrit to Persian and illustrated with Persian painting techniques. Second, blaming the British for Hindu prudery allows the very real memory of missionary Puritanism and the racist snobbery of the Raj Club culture to overpower the equally important role of other sorts of Brits, such as Burton, in the rediscovery of India's erotic heritage. But most of all, blaming the Muslims and the British ignores the history of native Hindu anti-eroticism. For as we've seen, India had its own homegrown traditions of prudery in opposition to its own sensuality. In India today, people will often give a copy of the Kama Sutra as a wedding present to demonstrate their open-mindedness and sophistication. But most people will merely sneak a surreptitious look at it in someone else's house. And on the public scene, a Hindu nationalist health minister can insist that the Indian traditions of abstinence and fidelity are more effective barriers against HIV than condoms. And the 1860 Penal Code, still in effect, defines all extramarital sex as criminal. For such Hindus, in India, but also increasingly in the American diaspora, the problem is not, as it was from those liberal Indian intellectuals, how to explain how India lost its appreciation of eroticism, but on the contrary, how to maintain that Hinduism was always nothing but the pure-minded, anti-erotic, ascetic tradition that it became for many upper-class Hindus in the 19th century. One way to make this argument was to swing to the other side of the pendulum and blame the British, this time not for suppressing Indian eroticism, but for causing it. Under Nehru, the Indian government passed a penal code of sexual repression, forbidding several, quote, sexual relations against nature with a man, woman, or animal, whether the intercourse is anal or oral. And this was legislation that these were acts that Nehru condemned by saying such vices in India were due to Western influence. On the contrary, in aping the Muslim and British scorn for Indian sexuality, contemporary Hindus who favor censorship are letting foreign ideas about Hinduism and Protestant fundamentalist ideas about censorship triumph over and drive out the native Hindu diversity and tolerance that have always characterized the world of the mind in Hinduism. For among other bad habits they picked up from the West, from seeds sown perhaps during colonization, but flowering only in the more recent contacts with American imperialism, was the habit of censorship. Never before has the old tension between the erotic and ascetic strains of Hinduism taken the form of one path telling the other path it has no right to exist. But the India of the ancient erotic past is not so easily stamped out. Even in the 19th century, most Hindus on the path that celebrated the earthier aspects of life didn't even know that the Anglophone Hindus regarded them as either beneath contempt or entirely non-existent. They went on worshiping their gods, singing their songs, telling their stories. And now they live on in a reported 2/3 of young adults who would have casual premarital sex before an arranged marriage, and who, since 1991, can buy condoms called Kama Sutra. Clearly, the attempt to transform the culture of the Kama Sutra into what many people, Hindus and non-Hindus alike, mistakenly refer to as the Karma Sutra, presumably a Vedantic text about sex and reincarnation, has not succeeded. Thank you.
Thank you all for extremely rich and I think provocative interventions. I'd say one thing that was very striking was that the two papers, Wendy and Shelley, your papers lay out a claim for, in fact, hope rather than despair, and point us to a kind of alternative way of reaching an understanding of the crisis by, in fact, expanding our options and returning by indeed cultivating the memory of a very rich literary tradition. And Lawrence and Ranjani, who discussed contemporary situations in India, pointed to this very powerful aspect of contemporary life in India and the contemporary making of public life, in fact, in which practices such as the sale of organs or technologies such as cinema and the other technologies that appear within them actually produce simultaneously both certainty and uncertainty, and Lawrence, as you put it, both hope and the limits of hope. So I think the floor is open for a discussion of, trying to put together these sort of very rich but, in fact, diverse range of possibilities for addressing what we all know and perceive to be a crisis at a very visceral and existential sort of level, as all of you have described it. So what I'd like to do is open the floor first to the speakers to address each other, and then to the audience for about, I think we have actually plenty of time for questions from the floor. And so we have until 4 p.m., at which time we'll break for half an hour and come back at 4:30 for the final panel. Thank you.
May I just ask Lawrence, just a question, I'd like more explanation on the origins of multi-organ failure. Where does this come about? And I'd like to just know more about your analysis of this phenomenon.
Briefly, the term's been around for a while. I mean, the question in part is there's a double answer. It's and I don't have a full answer yet because it's been now just a few months that I've started to think about this. And, in part after Jyoti Basu's death. The term in India has appeared in news accounts of deaths. I've basically been doing an archive for the last 25 years, and in the last, so far, 3 or 4 years, well, five years, and it saturates now contemporary media so that I make the point in the paper that in a series of political debates, the BJP or the Congress alliances accuse each other of multi-organ failure. So in part, you have the figure translates across regimes. It hasn't been a clinically terribly meaningful figure, and I stand to be corrected by clinicians in the audience, but it's certainly not one that was part of the pedagogy of many clinicians I talked to or myself. But there are very specific, or I would say this, there are very specific ranges of situations where the term had valence historically, but it has now become synonymous with the death of prominent persons.
So it's a status marker.
It's a status marker,
Small
but it's,
only have single organ failure.
Well, and so here I was making, more in the paper today than in the paper in Social Research, I was making the suggestion that this is in part an effect of a certain regime of media, which is that to the extent that that these deaths are reported in a very intensified way. And if you follow which you can see on YouTube, the media around PRAMOD MAHAJAN's assassination, and lingering time in the hospital, it's a very, very intense both coverage and pedagogy on each organ in question, and it's quite extraordinary to watch. And that in part is the effect of a very specific kind of media, and it's what I haven't yet done, because it's I can tell you the term doesn't have a lot of clinical valence, however, is begin to do historical interviews with clinicians in Delhi or elsewhere, in terms of their experiences of the shift, if it is that, in the register of how death is marked. I don't have an answer yet.
But Lawrence, is it a peculiarly Indian term, or?
No, but it's used in deaths, of prominent deaths that I've seen. I don't know yet. I mean, I actually did a friend and I came up with a list of about 100 prominent American politically charged deaths in the last decade. And we didn't find multi-organ failure used, with two exceptions. Now I can't tell you which of the two they are because I forget. So
Isn't the American term of natural causes, when someone old dies, when someone 50 dies, they say he died of cancer. But when someone in their 80s or 90s dies, they often say of natural causes, which is the equivalent in a way that you can't pin it down.
Well, it's tricky because a friend of mine who's a structuralist said that came up with a 2x2 wonderful scholar, Berkeley student also JPS Oberoi, said that basically what you set up is there's extraordinary people and ordinary people, extraordinary deaths and ordinary deaths, and so what this is all about is the ordinary deaths of extraordinary people, but the death of PRAMOD MAHAJAN was an extraordinary death. He was assassinated by his brother, and was followed very closely. And his brother, who comes out of prison for a furlough, dies quite mysteriously, according to rumor circles, of multi-organ failure. So it's
karma. It's karma.
The point here is not obviously to gloss the true meaning of multi-organ failure. The point is, struck by an intensified new language of death, try to think with it. And in some sense, as someone who thinks about how organs come to mean in a variety of registers.
I'm going to rise to Terry Pollock and ask him to tell us what lies next.
What lies next?
What can we do? What's the solution?
The check has to be cashed now, huh?
What's the solution?
Well, yes. I set up my noble truths, and then I wanted to say that I'm really no Buddha, and so I can't give you the marga. I've been thinking about this for maybe 20 some years, 25, maybe longer, as I saw the traditional pundit tradition in India disintegrate, and then I go back to places like Mysore, University of Mysore, when I was living there in the 80s. There were still people around who had taught there in the 30s and 40s. I mean, it really was a kind of I hate to make these invidious analogies, but it's sort of an Oxford of India sort of quality to it. And you go back in the mid-'80s and visit the Kannada Library at the University of Mysore and see the devastation. It's just heartbreaking. So,
what's the solution?
Well, okay. So anyway, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and my first cut into the matter was, look, when India wants to do something serious about a major problem, it can bring very powerful resources to bear. So when technology and science and management were deemed to be important state values, the Indian Institute of Science, Indian Institute of Technology, Institute of Management were established, and whatever one may say about them now, for a long time, they were sources of, they were engines of progress of a very important sort, and produced some really remarkable students. So, should the state, with a far less dramatic commitment of resources, produce something like the Indian Institute of Classical Studies? And when I've discussed this with people in India, the eyes grow wide, and oh yes, in fact, Kapil Sibal, this is something we really should do. And of course, then they go back, and nothing ever happens. I think it was Bruno Latour, during the troubles in the French universities 3 or 4 years ago, wrote an article in Le Monde, And one of the things he said was that the key thing we must do is to emancipate education from the double stranglehold of the state and the market. And I'm beginning to think that that, in fact, may be necessary. There are new universities. I'll be very brief here. There are new universities coming up: Nalanda, Sark University, Vedant University. Is it possible that some of these private universities might be, or the Pan-Asian University? I actually wrote a plan for a critical philology program for Nalanda University, and it's conceivable that might go forward, and who knows? I mean, we're not talking about huge numbers. I'm not talking about producing vast cadres of people, but a small, semi-independent institution that would take seriously the charge of reproducing a certain sort of knowledge, not just reproducing, but producing a critical form of classes, a kind of critical class open to critique through either a private or semi-public university seems to be one possible way to go. I know there are other initiatives. There are people talking about founding a private institute for classical studies. And there are these, as I mentioned, there are these entirely independent philanthropic initiatives like the one that Narayana Murthy and family started. I mean, they were convinced that a library of classical texts that would be made available to students in India at a highly subsidized price that would provide an instance of how it is done right. It would provide them with knowledge about their traditions. Might be a way to induce a certain kind of additional enthusiasm among students. But at the end of the day, the problem comes down to life chances. And who's going to walk away from a possible career in cell phone technology or IT to go into a university and unless there's a structure of incentives that makes it worthwhile. So people much smarter than me have to take this up, but there's a range of possible solutions that I've been thinking of.
Thank you, Shelley. There are a large number of questions already. Many hands are up. I was wondering if it's possible for people to come up to the mics on either side of the room,
Small enough place
or you can stand up and speak loudly. Yes. Oh, it's being recorded, so we'd like you to be at the mics. I'm sorry.
Or maybe.
They were those two gentlemen.
So I don't think this is working. Oh, it is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
So just to carry on this question that you raised, Shelley, but also to link it to a little bit of what Wendy's been raising. It seems to me that you've identified, or you're talking about two different aspects, interconnected, but also very different of this same problem. One is, how does classical literature and learning have mass appeal? How is it a living culture? And the other is, you're saying, how can we do it even if it's a small group of specialists keeping it alive? We don't have the people who want to do that or have the expertise to do that. And it seems to me that these two are connected questions. You're not going to have a small expert group unless somewhere there's a living culture to back it up. But I wondered if you would agree that part of the problem, and I was just thinking about this, that if in the 60s you say there were people doing this, and now there are not, it occurred to me that when all of us were students, part of the whole battle, at least in literary studies, was to do things, to be able to study things that we thought were contemporary and that were relevant. Right. And of course, part of the other problem was that the classics that were being dumped on Indian students were not Indian classics at all, but were Western classics, right? But somewhere in the debate, what happened is that to do Indian stuff was to do contemporary Indian stuff. And of course, that ended up biting us very badly. It became very evident within 4 or 5 years to me that when I was teaching in JNU, that I was in the middle of a very BJP, VHP department for whom the classics was it just took on a different spin altogether. So I remember writing an article about why I will still teach Shakespeare, having argued for years that we need to kind of make it decompulsory. But I think that part of the problem that we are seeing is a kind of functionalism where if you do women's studies, for example, it's got to be the here and now. And I was really moved by what you were talking about, a radical alterity, because the radical has become associated with the entirely contemporary, and I would argue that it's a crisis of literary education in general in India, and not just the classics. When you can think about the different disciplines that are thriving in India, and I can name 20 scholars, 30 scholars that I read and teach, there are very few literary critics left. Doing contemporary or past or anything. And one of the big crises is that people who do other disciplines in India don't read literary criticism. So that kind of interdisciplinarity that I do think paradoxically is also necessary to nurture any kind of expertise is entirely, I mean, I'm constantly battling with social scientific friends in India who will not read a thing in literary criticism. So I think the malaise is not just classical versus the contemporary, but a certain spin on what the literary is or what education is and so on. So this, of course, doesn't pertain to, for example, cinema. I think cinema studies is flourishing. Art will flourish, but literary studying, I think, is in a crisis. So that was one thing. And then in response to what Wendy was talking about, I also think that it's important to bring in another aspect of the contemporary, which is the whole feminist debates about erotica. And the point at which Hindu Puritanism and feminist Puritanism began to tie into each other, and we noticed that in several key moments. But these are very tricky issues because they also pertain to commercialization of the body and so on. So, you know, around the beauty pageants and so on. So I think just wanted to complicate both of those a little bit.
If I can reply to just part of what you said about Shelley's point about the BJP's involvement, I think that what was behind this, and I didn't get a chance to say, but it's really significant, I realized from your talk, is the idea of the identification of the, and Shelley knows about this too, goodness knows, the identification of the ancient Indian classics as spiritual Vedanta classics. We're talking about ancient Indian heritage, we talk about the Upanishads, and it's part of this same, it's not simply that the erotic texts, but that certain types of texts, which are religious texts, not secular texts, that the ancient heritage of India is religious always, that there's no secular literature, and that among the religious texts, only these are acceptable, and among those that are acceptable, only certain readings of them are acceptable, has dominated whatever impulse there is to study the past. Certainly we study the past, we recite the Veda. And that has siphoned off whatever energy there might be for studying past classics. So part of the problem.
That was a terrific comment. Very, very briefly, you know, one of the things I like to say, and I should have said, and I typically do say, is to express my profound sorrow and disgust at the way in which many of the classical traditions in India have been captured by the most reactionary forces in India today. And I will tell you that when I speak in India, I gave a lecture at the Rashtriya Sanskrit Sansthan not too long ago to 200 or 300 pundits and scholars of Sanskrit, and they were completely in agreement with me. The people who really know something in India are completely hostile to the way these forces have debased public discourse on classical material. So that's why when I sum up my view, it's really under the sign of a kind of critical classicism that we need to retake this material. And I agree with you completely. Actually, the bigger sign here, if I can use this now apparently antiquated word, is philology. I mean, philology, we've all been trying to return to philology for a long time now, and some of the people we most admire have called upon us to do this. It's simply, philology is a practice, philology in the big sense of learning to make sense of texts, of all kinds of texts, learning to read slowly, the slow reading in a fast world. Nietzsche's notion of langsame lesen, and to learn to read all kinds of texts, and the text of the world as well. A critical philology reads the world as well as the word. And the only thing is that the more distant in time and space the text is, the more prominent the methodological apparatus appears to our eyes. But whatever we are doing, whatever kind of text we're reading or world we're reading, whether it's, as Nietzsche said, whether it's the morning newspaper or the weather statistics, it is a philological practice. So I'm completely in agreement with you about both of those issues.
Lawrence, would you like to ask your question?
This is just to share my thought with Dr. Donica. You're right. Sex is not a taboo subject in Hinduism. Though I am an agnostic now, I was born and brought up as a Hindu. I became an agnostic not because there is anything wrong with Hinduism. That religion gives you total freedom to choose your own path to him or her, capital H. So I gave it up for the reason some of them you mentioned, that these Puritans are all the dirty, nauseating, sickening, disgusting things in this world are done in the name of religion and in the name of God. So I sent them both packing long ago to come to your subject, to come to the topic that you discussed. Though I'm an agnostic, I'm enamored of the stories about Lord Krishna, the most popular god in the Hindu pantheon. I'm enamored for this reason. He was surrounded by women all the time, and I couldn't get even one. So,
transcendental lewdness.
You go to any temple, if it is dedicated to Krishna, you see all the activities, whatever he did with women, all kinds of sexual activities with Radha, and other women jealously watching. All these sculptures and pictures I have seen. Even when I accompanied my mother to temples, this was what I was watching when she was worshipping to God. Anyway, this Puritanism, latter-day emergence of Puritanism in Indian politics, that is mainly the reason for this, whatever happened at Baroda University, politicization of religion by some extremists. Call it Hindu Taliban. I call them the Hindu Taliban. So the way to fight them is the way a few women in Bangalore did 4 years ago. When they were prohibited from celebrating Valentine's Day, they sent them some pink panties, truckload of pink panties, and I sent them an email requesting them, next time you force them to wear the panties, and they were calling themselves Ramasena, the army of Rama. I told them the appropriate name should be Vanarasena, the army of monkeys. You force them to wear them next time and parade them in public so that the next day newspapers will have a beautiful story. Monkeys in pink panties. Vanarasena.
Well, luckily there are in India a number of people like yourself who are protesting. I mean, Shelley's looking for allies. I'm looking for allies too, and there are allies. There are numerous protest movements in India.
Thank you for thinking like me.
Thank you for being one of them.
Okay, Lawrence, you get your turn now, and then we'll go back to taking questions.
This is a question. This is a question for Wendy, but I just want to respond and tie to what the gentleman just said. I went with my mother to Khajuraho. That was a mistake. Don't go with your mother to Khajuraho.
I went with my mother to Konark, and it was a great success. We got different mothers.
Yeah, it was just, oh boy. Okay, so I want to respond, because your talk works on two important levels, as a historical argument and as a polemic, and a very important historical argument and a very important polemic. So I want to just briefly say one thing, a question about each. So as historically, it works in part because you set up, I mentioned structuralism for reading into this. You set up a structuralist kind of binary. There's two ways. There's two pedals. There's two, and you offer a reading. And it's clever and also polemical. So I think you're saying but it's simplified. But it's beautiful. But so the question is, when are there? And obviously, when I think of, for example, Shiva the Erotic Aesthetic, I think about moments where, in fact, that structuralist reading becomes not only helpful but necessary to doing certain kinds of intellectual work. And so the question is are there moments when that kind of division doesn't work, and just intellectually. I mean, I'm not saying that and when are those important? I mean, it's as an example, but it's a structuralist example. I'm thinking of J.P.S. Oberoi's argument in Religion, Civil Society, and the State for the Sikh Guru, where he argues that, in fact, there is an elementary structure of medievalism, and the figure of the Guru brings together both the householder and the renouncer, and in a certain kind of collapse. But in which he in part, and this echoes Amitav Ghosh yesterday, is Oberoi's effort to produce an account of modernity not circuited through the West. So that is this kind of Bhakti era collapse of in this case, also the erotic and the ascetic. So then the polemic question is yes, and given what you've experienced and given the importance of your work, I get the polemic in several registers, but I want to pay attention to the question of what is it to be insulted or hurt in this world? What is it to see what is it to see an exhibition of God in a way that's very, very painful, and not just to reduce it to stupidity or being on the wrong side of a politics which people here seem to share, but actually to say, what does it mean to respond to the ethical conditions in which people find themselves, in which an exhibition of Hussein or anyone else comes to be very painful? Because yes, we can immediately bring in your colleague Lauren Berlant or my colleague Wendy Brown and think about the conditions of victimization and subject formation in our time, or other questions historically, but on some level, is there something to be said for also taking seriously the ethics of response in these moments?
Let me take the second one first, because it's a good one, and we have examples in here as well. It's a really First Amendment question, of course, basically, right? That people have a right to object to certain kind of language, shouting fire in a crowded theater being one of the cases where we challenge the First Amendment. Certainly, there's a whole range of things which people find religiously offensive. In order to simplify things, but not in the written version, I left out what the Catholics were offended by at that same exhibition, which was an obscene representation of the crucifixion and so forth. So, in the realm of offenses to religion, my only response is that it's impossible to calculate what will offend whom, and there are people who are very easily offended and the people who are not, and the only solution is to say, don't go to see this movie. Don't go to this exhibition. It's not for you. That the time when it becomes problematic is when you introduce, let's say, into the standard Eucharist celebration at a Catholic church, something which will be offensive to Catholics. But to have an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art that might be offensive to some Catholics, it seems to me, is legitimate. And I would say that it is also legitimate to have some art in India which will be offensive to some Hindus. And I think you're right, it is. But the idea of finding something personal offensive cannot be a legal principle. For one thing, offensive to whom, and for another, it does conflict with that rather precious issue of freedom of expression. So yes, there are things that I don't like either, and I just don't go to see those movies and so forth. That's the answer to the second one. The answer to the first one is that any oversimplified, you could even say reductionist model like the one I gave is going to have important exceptions. I think it's a useful way to realize what the two extremes are, and that there are two extremes that are always there in India, but the middle cases are really equally important and equally numerous. Tantrism itself is a complicated example of the joining together of a lot of erotic rituals and methodology in an ascetic ideal. It's really of individuals trying to, however you define tapas, right? Individuals trying to generate a kind of ascetic purity and power who do that through sexual rituals. Where in my structuralist binary thing would that fit? Nowhere is the answer. And even in Bhakti too, where you have people like the Lingayats, the Charanas, and other, especially in South India, but also in North India, some of the Bengal Vaishnavism traditions, where you have real renunciant ascetic movements in the sense of not participating in householder life, who nevertheless have enormously passionate songs to God which involve. So there are numerous important examples where that crossover. That certainly is true. My only point here was to simply say that you can find in the history of India examples which belie the accusation that either the British invented eroticism or that they destroyed eroticism, that there are these two different, at least those two extremes of those are in India. But you're right, that nothing is as tidy as that anywhere, and nothing is at all tidy ever in India. So that would not work.
Right, and let me say that, all of a sudden we're running out of time, despite the fact that we started with a good amount of time.
Time does that, doesn't
what
it?
I'd like to do is, there are 4 questions, 2 on this side and 2 on this side, that I could identify. So I'd like you to come up, and we'll take a group of questions and then, open it up for a general discussion.
15 minutes. Still have 15 minutes.
I'm Mukulika Banerjee. I just wanted to respond a little bit to Professor Pollock's desire for hope and whether there were, in fact, 2 recommendations to be made or things to be noted. One was the intervention of the state and setting up institutes may have caught the zeitgeist at the moment that the IITs and IIMs were set up, but the India of today, probably what we need alongside Indian institutes is, in fact, privatized classical education. It might, and I say this because, of course, you said if you have heard of people doing Sanskrit, then you haven't heard about it. The only thing I could come up with, which you haven't mentioned but you might have heard of, is this huge fad, really, a craze for doing Sanskrit in IT parks in Bangalore, where young software professionals want to learn Sanskrit. And this is catching on. And somehow this is completely outside institutional, certainly state institutional interventions. I don't know very much about it. I'm sure you might do. The second thing, of course, what the state could do is perhaps, certainly as a consumer, and I'm not alone in this room by any means, is to perhaps in one stroke remove the 3 years of Sanskrit that school children in the central education system have to do, which, if there ever is a disincentive, it is the Sanskrit education that people do have. So it is the devil, and it's the devil that comes out with horns and scales, and you definitely don't want to. So, and the provenance, of course, of that introduction of the Sanskrit as the language to be taught is so politically dubious, and was a response to the two language to deal with the South and to deal with the anti-Hindi movement. That was never a policy for classical education anyway. So if that could be removed, that might actually do something for a greater enthusiasm.
I have a brief comment about Professor Pollock's presentation, which I enjoyed very much and which I agree with. But I would like to add a further dimension to the crisis. And that is, it is one thing to talk about people studying, let us say, classics like in Kannada, and that's my language, so I'll talk about that, in Kannada. And many of these classics are in Old Kannada, so the greatest of them, one of them is 1,000 years old and another is 500 years old and so on. A lot of people are not doing that. The other dimension of it is studying these in translation. Many of these classics, which are world-class, are not available in English. And the Kannada scholars themselves are not able to translate these into English because they studied only Kannada, and most of them, the really good classical scholars in Kannada, are not bilingual in English, unlike in the previous generation that you talked about. And so we have this situation where you have a lot of people with wonderful literary sensibility who studied through the English medium and studied English literature, but they do not have access to the old classics. And on the other hand, you have the old classical Kannada scholars or regional language scholars who do not have access to English, and we need to bridge the gap between them. So I hope that your series would be one of those that will do it, although it would be difficult to find the people who will do this. Recently, I attended a conference on the Mahabharata in Delhi, where I gave a paper on Kannada classic. And the interesting thing, one of the things that generated hope is that a lot of people from Delhi University who were studying in the modern languages department and doing comparative literature demanded that I give another talk just about this Kannada classic and talking about it in terms of putting it in the world context and so on. And they also told me that in many of the English literature MA curricula in universities in Delhi and other places, they have introduced courses in Indian classics. When I was a student of MA in English literature and linguistics a long time ago, the regional languages were not even mentioned in the English departments. Now things seem to be changing, so maybe that's another cause for hope.
Please.
So thanks for this great panel and for all the provocative things. This question comes...
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Priya Joshi. I teach at Temple. But for some years, I taught in the core curriculum at Columbia, so there is this great books component. But I want to just divorce this conversation from the institution and bring it to the street. I mean, so many of your conversations are about translations and philology and complet, all of which many of us have degrees in and have taught in, but we're sort of irrelevant to the 1.1 billion people in India. So in a sense, I wonder if the conversation about the relevance of classics could be taking place elsewhere and maybe need to be invigorated there. Language is clearly an issue for many of us. I mean, I took 5 years of Sanskrit in India. I abhorred it, and to this day, I'm sorry, Shali. Right? So, but that hasn't stopped me from understanding the kind of arguments you're making. So I'm wondering, the Amar Chitra Kathas are put out in Hindi, in English, and a gazillion languages. They have dubious politics in some of them, pretty interesting politics in another. That's one way where these resources could emerge. Cinema, so Ranjani's work. Your work, Ranjani, in this paper is, of course, very much of the cinema of the last decade. But of course, your earlier work, and the work many of us do, is about the ways in which these ideas of the Indian classics get reinvested and invigorated through popular culture. So one wonders if those could be places where, the question of the classics inoculate and penetrate and have a kind of continued currency.
Yeah, great point. One more question, and then we'll go back to the...
I am Narayan Hegde. Somewhat extending the point made by this lady just now. The kind of institutions that Shelley suggests to promote the classical texts, I'm not entirely sure whether it would necessarily ensure an upsurge of interest in the classics. There have been attempts, for example, by the government of Karnataka about 25 years ago, to make classics available for a nominal cost. And that has not resulted in a revival of interest in the classics. Something on the lines of popularizing it, or making it relevant, or inspiring it through mass media or something, might work. That's my suggestion. And I have a suggestion for this gentleman who prefers agnosticism over Hinduism. I don't think Hinduism and agnosticism are mutually incompatible. I'm sure he has heard of Charvaka school of Hinduism. So he doesn't have to give up Hinduism.
That's true, absolutely.
So before I invite the speakers to respond, I have a question for Ranjani, actually, in fact. So Ranjani, sort of following up on this line of thinking, I'm reminded of point in, well, maybe it was in the mid-'80s when, at least in South Indian cinema and Telugu cinema that I'm somewhat familiar with, there was this moment of revivalism in, particularly with regard to classical performing arts. So there was a very, very well-known movie, Shankarabharanam, which was all about classical music and kind of so in other words, it pointed, in fact, I mean, it was a very conservative film at some level, but what it did was it opened up a debate about, the decline of classical musical traditions and so on. And it seems to me that at this particular moment, well, cinema is in fact a medium that is extremely sensitive, in other words, or can be symptomatic of those debates. So in a way, what your presentation actually points to another kind of symptomatic reading of this crisis or decline in relating ourselves to a classical tradition or to classical culture that seems to have completely disappeared, and as you point out, has been replaced by certain forms of stereotypical images. Now, having said that, I'm just wondering if you could elaborate the differences between in the three films that you presented in these 2 points of view, where in Black Friday and in Amir you spoke about a view that is that's very much a view from the street and being in the street, and is yet producing a kind of transcendental picture of of this kind of declined city, right? And then the view in A Wednesday, which is from a rooftop, and as well as from the war room and various other kind of sites of surveillance, which have a God's eye view already, but where that film is trying to put a common man in the transcendental position. So almost trying to sort of elevate the public from the street to to this position from which they too can participate, but participate in what, right? Particularly if your reading of these films is that they're about a city that is an archive of post Babri Masjid demolition. Then what has happened to the nation? I mean, what are exactly they surveilling through these two techniques, like this view from the street and the view from the roof? So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because again, that would point us to the direction maybe in which the future of the public might be articulated, because again, I think that cinema is incredibly suggestive and symptomatic of the debates to come, as it were.
Okay. Okay. Having grown up in a middle-class Bengali family where good literature, high culture was the norm, I would call myself in some ways a rebel against the classical tradition, and actually did not go to cinema to discover the classics. I saw something quite different in cinema, which is it's always been a hybrid form, and it drew from very different kinds of traditions. And the films that I'm dealing with actually cannot be located in any classical tradition. This is a very different formation that has emerged, and to try and fix it in that tradition would not help us to understand what is going on in cinema. So in some senses, what happens with cinema is that it turns everything into a much more complicated form, and one would have to then really relate to film as film to see what is going on over there. But I absolutely believe that that's the kind of education we all got, and in that education, cinema was not to be taken seriously because it was not art, it was not culture, and that it's very interesting that in the return to look at cinema now, one is trying to trace something intrinsically Indian and classical in that cinema. And while there are those traditions, it is actually much more complicated than that, because it's driven by technology. It was an international form right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. So that's what I feel that one has to be very careful about in trying to recuperate cinema also as part of a kind of Indian classical tradition. There are problems there. But this cinema that I'm talking about is actually coming out of a global form. This is Asian cinema, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and this is a kind of cinematics. It's a circulation of signage that has developed in the last 10, 15 years, where there's a fascination for a sensorium and violence and horror and the physical destruction of the body, and the dystopian has become a very powerful dimension over here. So I cannot answer questions in terms of, what is it that they are surveilling, but how is surveillance producing a language of the city or a new map of the city? Or what are these technologies and what is the imagination of Bombay that is emerging through these kinds of devices? So it's really about new maps, new ways of producing knowledge about cities, new ways of encountering this world that we live in. And crisis images can also be images of hope if one looks at them as dystopic, because the other side of dystopia is always a desire for the loss of utopia. And one last thing I'd like to say is that because Indian melodrama has been such a powerful form, and very, very powerful form, we are all drawn to that form, but there is a crisis in that form. It is the reason, and there is a crisis also in the way in which one can respond to questions of conflict of this nature. And I think these films can be placed in that moment where the inability to articulate this crisis produces this form, where it's a thin line and one doesn't know where the cinema is actually going to go. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Shelley.
Well, I just wanted to thank Mukulika and Priya and Sridhar and Narayana Hegde for their wonderful questions. Obviously, I don't have time to go into any detail, but pedagogy, popularity, translation, these are all really key questions. But I think there are a couple of things I just want to remind us of. This is not really about Sanskrit. Every classical tradition in India is under very serious, as I say, in my extremist way, there is a cultural ecocide underway in India. This kind of rainforest of cultural diversity is really being threatened. And it's every single tradition that we can identify. So just take that away with you. It's rather counterintuitive, but I think it's worth saying, although only Sridhar actually brought this up. And it's rather late in the day to mention this, but there is a oddly counterintuitive relationship between the collapse of classical knowledge in India and the collapse of English. I don't know quite fully how to understand it, but I have traveled enough in India from north to south, and I've been to many, many colleges. Indian kids are not reading English anymore. Faculty are not reading English, and here's the kicker. Nothing is being translated into the regional languages. One of my articles years ago was translated by Marxist-Leninists in Kerala. But I do not know a single work in Indian studies that has ever been translated into Hindi. Gayatri's Can the Subaltern Speak has never been translated into an Indian language. So there is, and I say counterintuitive, this is across the board. The translation, and this has been, the Knowledge Commission has recognized, I don't know what they're going to do about it, and I say counterintuitive because I think the retreat on the part of Indian professoriate from the world republic of scholarship is partly, and the consequent collapse of classical studies is partly to do with the retreat from participation in English scholarship and in literature. Yeah, so there are very, very deep questions here. Very interesting, smart people in India are thinking about these questions. And the point I want to end with is that if we do not have a solution, we can at least continue the conversation as loudly as possible. Thank you.
Great. That would be a great note to end, but I'd like to invite Lawrence and Wendy and Ranjani to ask if you have any final thoughts and wrap-up comments, after which we'll take a break for half an hour and reconvene at 4:30.
I think that's a good note to end on.